How did I end up with divorce papers in my hand, my husband's eyes empty and cold, after one unforgettable dinner? What made him change from the man everyone pitied to the one calmly taking control? And why did I never see it coming? All I did was laugh when he cried. So why am I the one losing everything now? The divorce papers felt heavier than they should have in my trembling hands. Ewan sat across from me in the sterile conference room, his eyes completely empty of the warmth I'd taken for granted for 15 years. The man who used to bring me coffee in bed every morning now looked at me like I was a stranger. No, worse than a stranger, like I was something distasteful he needed to dispose of. "How did we get here?" I whispered, but he didn't even blink. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in an expensive suit, slid another document across the polished table. "Mrs. Vane, these are the custody arrangements. As you can see, your husband is requesting primary custody of both children." My world tilted sideways. "Primary custody? Ewan, you can't be serious. I'm their mother." For the first time in months, he spoke directly to me. His voice was calm, measured, completely devoid of emotion. "You should have thought about that before you decided our family wasn't worth your respect." The memory hit me like a physical blow. That dinner 6 months ago when he'd broken down crying in front of everyone, and I'd laughed. God help me, I'd actually laughed at my husband's tears. At the time, it seemed like he was being dramatic, embarrassing us all with his emotional outburst. Now, staring at the evidence of my affair spread across the legal table like accusations, I finally understood what I'd destroyed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a woman who thought she had everything under control ended up losing absolutely everything that mattered. 3 months before that devastating dinner, I was convinced I was the victim in my own marriage. "Thalassa, dinner's ready," Ewan called from the kitchen, his voice carrying that same gentle tone he'd used for 15 years. I barely looked up from my phone, where Mason's latest text made my heart race in a way my husband's voice hadn't in years. "Can't stop thinking about our conversation today. You deserve so much more than what you're getting at home." I smiled at the screen, feeling that familiar flutter of excitement that had been missing from my life for so long. Mason understood me in ways Ewan never could. He saw my potential, my needs, my desires for something bigger than this suburban routine. "Mum, Dad says dinner's getting cold." 13-year-old Lila appeared in the doorway of our home office, her dark hair falling across her face in that way that reminded me painfully of Ewan. "I'll be there in a minute, sweetheart," I said, quickly closing my phone. "Just finishing up some work stuff." The lie came so easily now. Everything had become a lie, and somehow I'd convinced myself that was Ewan's fault. If he'd been more exciting, more ambitious, more something, I wouldn't need to find fulfillment elsewhere. I walked into our dining room to find the usual scene. Ewan setting down plates of his homemade lasagna, 9-year-old Toby already digging in with the enthusiasm only children possess, and Lila helping pour drinks. It was picture-perfect domesticity, and it made me feel trapped. "Smells amazing," I said automatically, taking my seat. Ewan's face lit up with that hopeful smile that used to make my heart skip. Now it just reminded me of everything I felt I was missing. "I tried a new recipe," he said, settling into his chair across from me. "Added some herbs from the garden. Thought we could maybe watch that movie you mentioned after the kids go to bed." There it was, that eager attempt to connect, to salvage whatever was left between us. 3 months ago, I might have appreciated the effort. Now, with Mason's words still echoing in my mind, it felt suffocating. "Actually, I have some calls to make tonight. Work stuff," I said, not meeting his eyes. "Maybe tomorrow." I caught the flash of disappointment across his face before he covered it with understanding. Always so understanding, my Ewan. Always making excuses for my behavior, always trying to accommodate my needs. It should have made me grateful. Instead, it made me feel guilty, and I hated feeling guilty. "Everything okay at the office?" he asked, cutting into his lasagna. You've been working a lot of late nights recently. My phone buzzed. Another text from Mason. I fought the urge to check it immediately. Just busy season, I said. You know how it is. But Ewan was a high school teacher. His busy seasons were clearly defined, predictable. My job as an office administrator at a small marketing firm had never required the kind of hours I'd been claiming lately. Mum, can you help me with my history project this weekend? Lila asked, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension. It's about family traditions. Of course, baby, I said, though my mind was already planning when I could meet Mason at the gym. He'd been hinting about showing me some private training techniques that had nothing to do with fitness. What's your project about specifically? Ewan asked, genuinely interested in our daughter's schoolwork in a way that used to make me proud. Now it just highlighted how checked out I'd become. As Lila launched into an explanation about researching our family history, I felt my phone buzz again. This time I couldn't resist glancing at it under the table. Tomorrow after work, I have something special planned for us. The thrill that shot through me was immediately followed by a stab of guilt as I looked up to see Ewan watching me with curious eyes. Work emergency? He asked quietly. Something like that, I said, putting the phone face down on the table. Nothing that can't wait until after dinner. But the damage was done. I could see the questions forming behind his eyes, the way he was starting to piece together my distracted behavior, my late nights, my constant phone checking. Part of me wanted him to confront me, to give me a reason to justify what I was doing. The other part of me, the part that was already too deep into this affair to back out gracefully, hoped he'd stay blind just a little longer. Dad, can we have ice cream for dessert? Toby piped up, saving us all from the awkward silence that had settled over the table. I think we can manage that, Ewan said, his smile returning as he focused on our son. But only if you finish all your vegetables. I watched my husband interact with our children, patient, loving, present in a way I hadn't been for months, and felt that familiar resentment bubble up. It was so easy for him, this domestic contentment. He genuinely enjoyed these quiet family dinners, these simple moments that felt like prison bars to me. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. My phone buzzed a third time. Ewan's eyes flicked to it, then back to my face. Popular night, he said lightly, but there was something different in his tone, something sharper. Just Kendra from work, I lied smoothly. She's having drama with her boyfriend again. You know how it is. I did know how it was, actually. Kendra had been my biggest enabler in this whole affair, constantly telling me I deserved better, that I was too young and attractive to settle for a boring marriage. She painted my relationship with Mason as some kind of feminist awakening, rather than what it actually was, a betrayal of everything I'd claimed to value. After dinner, Ewan started clearing the dishes while I finally checked Mason's messages. The latest one made my pulse quicken. Wear that blue dress tomorrow. The one that makes your eyes look incredible. I want to take you somewhere special. I was so absorbed in typing my response that I didn't notice Ewan standing behind me until he cleared his throat. Kids are doing homework, he said carefully. Thought maybe we could talk. I quickly closed my phone, but not before he caught a glimpse of the screen. His face went very still. Talk about what? I asked, though my heart was pounding. About us, he said simply. About whatever's been going on with you lately. Thalassa, I know something's wrong. I just want to help. There it was, the opening I could have taken to come clean, to end this before it destroyed everything. For just a moment, looking at his earnest, worried face, I almost did it. Almost told him about Mason, about how lost and trapped I'd been feeling, about how sorry I was for letting it get this far. Instead, I heard myself say, "Nothing's wrong, Ewan. You're being paranoid." The word paranoid hit him like a slap. I watched him physically recoil, and something hardened in his expression. Paranoid, he repeated quietly. Right, I'm sorry for caring about my wife." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my phone and my lies, and the growing certainty that I'd just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband's rigid form, I told myself I was the victim here. That Ewan was too sensitive, too needy, too willing to make me feel guilty for wanting something more than this predictable life we'd built together. I had no idea that he was already 3 steps ahead of me, quietly documenting every lie, every late night, every suspicious phone call. I thought I was the one in control of this situation. I couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, I found myself in the office break room with Kendra and Julia, rehashing the previous night's tension over terrible coffee and day-old donuts. "He's being controlling," Kendra declared, stirring sugar into her cup with more force than necessary, "checking up on your phone usage, questioning your work schedule, classic signs of an insecure man." Julia nodded enthusiastically. "My ex used to do the same thing. It's emotional manipulation, Thalassa. He's trying to make you feel guilty for having a life outside of him." I basked in their support, letting their words wash away the nagging doubt that had kept me awake most of the night. This was exactly what I needed to hear, that I wasn't the problem, that Ewan's growing suspicion was actually a character flaw rather than a natural response to my behavior. "The thing is," I said, lowering my voice conspiratorially, "he used to be so confident, so sure of himself. Now he's constantly asking if everything's okay, if I'm happy, if there's anything he can do to help. It's exhausting." "Ugh, the neediness," Julia grimaced. "There's nothing less attractive than a desperate husband." "You deserve someone who appreciates you without all the drama," Kendra added. "Someone who makes you feel alive again." Someone like Mason, they meant, though we didn't say his name out loud. The affair was still our little secret, shared in whispers and knowing looks, making me feel like I was part of some exclusive club of women who refused to settle for ordinary lives. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Carla. "Can we grab lunch today? Need to talk to you about something." I showed the message to Kendra, who rolled her eyes. "Let me guess. She wants to lecture you about family values and working on your marriage." "Probably," I sighed. Carla had been increasingly distant lately, ever since I'd confided in her about feeling disconnected from Ewan. I'd been careful not to mention Mason directly, but my sister had always been too perceptive for her own good. "Just remember," Julia said, gathering her things to head back to her desk, "you can't live your life to make other people comfortable, even family." "Especially family," I thought as I texted Carla back, agreeing to meet at our usual cafe downtown. The same cafe where Mason and I had shared our first real conversation 3 months ago, where he'd listened to my complaints about my marriage with such understanding, such validation of my feelings. At lunch, Carla got straight to the point in that way of hers that used to comfort me but now felt like an attack. "Thalassa, I'm worried about you," she said, barely touching her salad. "You've been different lately, distracted, and from what you've told me about your problems with Ewan—" "What about them?" I asked defensively. "They sound like normal marriage stuff, the kind of things you work through, not run away from." I felt my jaw tighten. "You don't understand what it's like, Carla. You and David have this perfect relationship where you never get bored, never feel like you're disappearing into someone else's idea of what your life should be." "Perfect?" Carla laughed, but there was no humor in it. "David and I went through a rough patch 2 years ago, where we barely spoke for 3 months. But we went to counseling. We did the work. We didn't just give up." "I'm not giving up," I protested, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. "I'm just exploring who I am outside of being Ewan's wife and the kid's mother." Carla's expression softened slightly. "And how exactly are you exploring that?" This was the moment I could have told her about Mason, about the gym sessions that had nothing to do with fitness, about the way he made me feel beautiful and desirable and alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible, about how he encouraged me to put myself first for once in my life. Instead, I said, "I'm just taking some time for myself. Is that such a crime?" Not at all, Carla said carefully. But Thalassa, whatever you're doing, whoever you're spending time with, just remember that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences affect more than just you. The warning was clear, even if she couldn't bring herself to voice her suspicions directly. I felt a flash of anger at her presumption, her judgment, her inability to understand that I was finally doing something for myself after 15 years of putting everyone else's needs first. I think I know how to manage my own life, I said coolly. Do you? Carla asked quietly. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're about to blow up everything good you've built for something that probably isn't worth it. I left that lunch feeling frustrated and misunderstood, more convinced than ever that everyone in my life was trying to keep me trapped in a role I'd outgrown. When Mason texted asking if I could meet him at the gym early, I didn't hesitate to say yes. The gym after hours was a different world, dimly lit, empty except for the two of us, filled with possibilities that had nothing to do with exercise. Mason had a key because he sometimes trained private clients after regular hours, and being alone with him in that space felt dangerous and thrilling in equal measure. You look stressed, he said, moving closer than any trainer should. Trouble at home? My husband's getting suspicious, I admitted, letting him guide me through some stretches that were completely unnecessary, but gave him an excuse to touch me. And my sister thinks I'm making a mistake. What do you think? He asked, his hands warm on my shoulders as he adjusted my position. I think, I said, turning to face him, that I'm tired of living my life according to other people's expectations. He smiled that slow, confident smile that had first caught my attention months ago. Good, because you deserve so much more than settling for comfortable. When he kissed me, I felt that familiar rush of excitement, of being wanted and desired in a way that had nothing to do with domestic responsibilities or family obligations. This was about me, my needs, my desires, my right to happiness. I drove home that evening with my lips still tingling and my conscience carefully suppressed. Ewan was in the kitchen helping Toby with his math homework when I walked in, and the scene struck me as almost aggressively normal after the intensity of my afternoon with Mason. How was lunch with Carla? Ewan asked, without looking up from Toby's workbook. Fine, I said automatically. She's dealing with some work stuff. Another lie, so smooth and natural I barely registered it. Ewan nodded absently, but I caught him glancing at me in that new way he'd developed, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed Ewan sitting at his desk in our bedroom, writing in what looked like a journal. He'd never kept a journal before, and something about the way he quickly closed it when I approached made my stomach clench with unease. "What's that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Nothing important," he said, but his voice had that same careful quality it had taken on lately. "Just some thoughts about work." I wanted to press him, to demand to know what he was writing about, but I was afraid of what I might discover. Instead, I climbed into bed and pretended to read while my mind raced with possibilities. Was he documenting my behavior? Building some kind of case against me? The paranoid thought should have seemed ridiculous, but something about his recent demeanor, the quiet observation, the careful questions, the way he'd started paying attention to details he'd previously ignored, made me wonder if my husband was more aware of my activities than I'd realized. That night, I lay awake listening to his steady breathing and wondering when exactly the man sleeping next to me had stopped being the predictable, trusting husband I'd taken for granted and become someone I couldn't quite read. I was about to find out just how much I'd underestimated him. The dinner that changed everything started innocuously enough. Ewan's parents were visiting for the weekend, along with my sister Carla and her family. It was supposed to be a pleasant family gathering, the kind of evening I used to enjoy before I started viewing our domestic life as a prison rather than a sanctuary. I should have known something was different when Ewan spent the entire afternoon cooking with unusual intensity, preparing all of my favorite dishes, with a precision that seemed almost methodical. At the time, I thought he was trying to impress me, to win me back with the kind of thoughtful gestures that had characterized our early relationship. I couldn't have been more wrong. "Everything smells wonderful, son," Ewan's father, Alan, said, as we all gathered around our dining room table. The good china was out, candles were lit, and the whole scene looked like something from a magazine spread about perfect family dinners. "Ewan's always been such a good cook," his mother Margaret added, shooting me one of those pointed looks she'd perfected over the years. "Thalassa is so lucky to have a husband who takes care of the household duties." There was an edge to her comment that I'd grown used to ignoring, but tonight it grated more than usual. Margaret had never quite approved of me, always finding subtle ways to suggest that I wasn't grateful enough for her son's devotion. "Yes, well, we all have our strengths," I said with a tight smile, reaching for my wine glass. I'd already had 2 glasses while getting ready, needing something to calm the strange anxiety that had been building all day. Mason had texted me earlier, asking when we could meet again, and I'd been forced to put him off until after this family obligation. The delay had left me feeling restless and resentful, especially sitting here pretending to be the perfect wife and mother when I felt anything but. "Mum's been working really hard lately," Lila said loyally, though I caught the uncertain look she gave me. "She has lots of important meetings." "Oh?" Margaret's eyebrows rose with interest. "What kind of meetings?" Before I could answer, Ewan spoke up from his position at the head of the table. "Thalassa's been putting in a lot of extra hours, haven't you, honey?" There was something in his tone, a careful neutrality that made me look at him more closely. His face was pleasant, smiling even, but his eyes held an expression I'd never seen before. Something cold and calculating that made my stomach flutter with unease. "Just the usual administrative stuff," I said quickly. "Nothing too exciting." "I'm sure," Margaret said with that particular brand of false sympathy she'd mastered. "It must be difficult, balancing work demands with family responsibilities." The implied criticism was clear, that I was prioritizing work over my family, that I was somehow failing in my primary duties as a wife and mother. Normally, I would have let it slide, but tonight, with wine in my system and frustration at having to postpone my meeting with Mason, I felt my temper flare. "Actually, Margaret, it's refreshing to focus on something other than domestic duties occasionally," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Some of us need intellectual stimulation beyond grocery shopping and meal planning." The silence that followed was deafening. Carla gave me a warning look across the table, while Alan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But it was Ewan's reaction that caught me off guard. Instead of looking hurt or embarrassed by my rudeness to his mother, he seemed almost satisfied. "Of course," he said smoothly, "we all need outlets for our various interests and needs." Something about the way he said interests made my blood run cold, but before I could analyze it further, Margaret launched into her response. "Well, I suppose different generations have different priorities," she said with icy politeness. "In my day, we understood that marriage required sacrifice and commitment. And look how well that worked out," I shot back, the wine making me bolder than I should have been. "A generation of women who gave up their identities to become appendages to their husbands." "Thalassa," Carla said quietly, "maybe we should change the subject." But I was on a roll now, months of suppressed resentment pouring out in front of our entire family. "No, I think it's important to be honest about these things. Just because previous generations accepted being trapped in unfulfilling relationships doesn't mean we have to." "Trapped?" Ewan's voice was very quiet, but something in it made everyone at the table go still. "Is that how you see our marriage, Thalassa? As a trap?" I should have backed down then. Should have seen the dangerous waters I was wading into and found a way to retreat gracefully. Instead, emboldened by wine and months of justifying my affair to myself, I doubled down. "I see our marriage as something that's evolved beyond what it used to be," I said, meeting his eyes directly. "We're different people than we were 15 years ago, Ewan. maybe it's time we acknowledged that. Different how? He asked, and there was something in his voice now that made even the children go quiet. You've become... I paused, searching for words that would hurt him the way his complacency had hurt me. Predictable, safe, content with this small life when there's so much more out there to experience. I watched my husband's face crumble as my words hit their target. For a moment, he looked exactly like the man who'd proposed to me 20 years ago. Young, vulnerable, completely open in his love for me. Then something shifted, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I thought safe was good, he said quietly. I thought predictable meant stable. I thought I was building something with you, not trapping you in something. The raw pain in his voice should have stopped me, should have made me realize what I was doing to this man who had loved me faithfully for 2 decades. Instead, it made me feel powerful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Oh, Ewan, I said with a laugh that sounded cruel even to my own ears. You're being so dramatic. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're too sensitive, too emotional. Everything has to be this big, meaningful thing with you. That's when it happened. My husband, this strong, steady man who had been my rock for 15 years, began to cry. Not just tearing up, but actual sobs that shook his shoulders and made his whole body tremble. And I laughed. God help me. I looked at this man breaking down in front of our children, our parents, our family, and I laughed like it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. Are you seriously crying right now? I asked, my voice dripping with disdain. In front of everyone. This is exactly what I mean, Ewan. This is embarrassing. The room erupted in chaos. Lila burst into tears and ran from the table. Toby sat frozen in his chair, his young face confused and frightened. Carla was staring at me with horror, while Margaret looked between her sobbing son and me with an expression of pure disgust. How dare you? Margaret breathed, her voice shaking with rage. How dare you humiliate him like this? But I was too far gone to stop, too drunk on my own cruelty to see what I was destroying. He's humiliating himself, I said coldly. I'm just pointing out that grown men shouldn't have emotional breakdowns at dinner parties. Ewan stood up slowly, wiping his face with his napkin. When he looked at me, his eyes were completely empty, not hurt, not angry, just nothing. You're right, he said quietly. I am being embarrassing. He walked out of the dining room without another word, leaving me sitting there with the wreckage of our family dinner and the horrified faces of people who had just watched me destroy a good man for sport. Thalassa, Carla said, her voice barely above a whisper, what have you done? But I wasn't ready to face that question yet. Instead, I drained my wine glass and told myself that Ewan had brought this on himself by being so weak, so needy, so unable to handle honest communication about our relationship. I had no idea that upstairs, my husband was making a phone call to a lawyer, his voice steady and calm, as he explained that he needed help protecting his children from what his marriage had become. I had no idea that by mocking his tears, I had just sealed my own fate. The morning after the dinner disaster, I woke up with a pounding headache and the slow, creeping realization that I might have gone too far. The house was eerily quiet. No sounds of Ewan making breakfast, no children's voices, no normal family morning routine. I found a note on the kitchen counter in Ewan's careful handwriting. Took kids to my parents' house. Need some time to think. We'll talk when I get back. The absence felt strange rather than liberating. For the first time in months, I had the house completely to myself, but instead of relief, I felt an odd hollowness that I quickly pushed aside. This was Ewan being dramatic again, I told myself, making a big production out of what had essentially been an honest conversation about our relationship. My phone buzzed with a text from Kendra. How did the family dinner go? Ready for some girl time? I found myself pouring out the entire story to Kendra and Julia over lunch, carefully editing the events to cast myself as the victim of Ewan's emotional manipulation. He actually started crying, Julia asked, her eyes wide with second-hand embarrassment. In front of everyone? Full-on sobbing, I confirmed, taking a large sip of my mimosa. It was mortifying. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Pretend that kind of behavior is normal? You were absolutely right to call him out, Kendra said firmly. Men who use tears to manipulate their wives are the worst. It's emotional blackmail. Exactly. I felt validated, justified in my reaction. And now he's punishing me by taking the kids away, like I'm the one who did something wrong. But even as I said it, I could hear Carla's voice in my head from the night before, the way she'd looked at me with such disappointment and disbelief. My sister had left shortly after Ewan's breakdown, barely saying goodbye, her husband David looking at me like I was a stranger. Your family will come around, Julia said, reading my expression. They just need time to see that you're not going to be manipulated by guilt trips. And if they don't, Kendra added, maybe you need to ask yourself whether they're really supporting your happiness and growth. It was exactly what I needed to hear, that I wasn't the problem, that everyone else was just too traditional, too willing to accept unhealthy relationship dynamics. I spent the afternoon at the gym with Mason, letting him work out my stress in ways that had nothing to do with exercise. Your husband sounds like a real piece of work, Mason said afterward, as we sat in his car in the parking lot. Using emotional manipulation to make you feel guilty for being honest about your needs. I know, right? I said, leaning into his warmth. I'm finally standing up for myself, and everyone acts like I'm the villain. That's because they're threatened by your independence, he said, his hand tracing patterns on my arm. Strong women make weak people uncomfortable. When Ewan returned that evening with the children, the temperature in our house had dropped by several degrees. He was polite but distant, going through the motions of normal family life, while somehow managing to avoid any real interaction with me. How is Grandma and Grandpa's? I asked Lila as she did her homework at the kitchen table. She looked up at me with eyes that held a new wariness, a careful consideration that hadn't been there before. Fine, she said simply, then returned to her math problems. Lila, honey, about last night. I don't want to talk about it, she said without looking up. The rejection stung more than I'd expected. Lila had always been my ally, my little confidant who understood me in ways the others didn't. Now she was looking at me like I was someone she couldn't quite trust. Toby was even worse. He barely spoke to me at all, staying close to Ewan and flinching slightly when I tried to hug him goodnight. It was like my own children had become strangers overnight. We need to talk, I told Ewan after the kids were in bed. Do we? He asked, not looking up from the papers he was grading at the kitchen table. Ewan, I think you're overreacting to what happened last night. Yes, maybe I could have been more tactful, but... Tactful, he repeated quietly. Is that what you call it? I call it honest, I said, my defensive mechanisms kicking in. I'm sorry if the truth hurt your feelings, but we can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. For the first time since he'd returned, he looked directly at me. His eyes held that same emptiness I'd seen the night before, but now there was something else, a kind of cold assessment that made me uncomfortable. You're right, he said finally. We can't keep pretending. Something about his tone made me nervous, but I pressed on. So we agree that we need to make some changes. Maybe try counseling or... I've been thinking about what you said, he continued as if I hadn't spoken. About being trapped, about needing more than this small life we've built. Good, I said, though his calm delivery was unsettling. I think if we're both honest about what we need... I need you to be honest about where you've been spending your time, he said quietly, about who you've been spending it with. My blood ran cold. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the gym membership you think I don't know about, the one that charges our joint account every month for sessions you've never mentioned. I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet, but I forced myself to stay calm. I've been working out. Is that a crime? With Mason Hyde? The name hung in the air between us like an accusation. I don't know how he'd found out Mason's name, but the fact that he had meant this conversation was far more dangerous than I'd realized. He's a trainer, I said carefully. I'm paying for professional services. I'm sure you are, Ewan said, and there was something in his voice that made my skin crawl. The question is, what kind of services? How dare you, I said, summoning my indignation to cover my panic. How dare you spy on me and then accuse me of whatever it is you think you're accusing me of? I'm not accusing you of anything, he said calmly. I'm asking you to be honest with me, with yourself, with our children. I am being honest. The lie came out as a shout, and I realized I was losing control of this conversation. Just because you're paranoid and insecure doesn't mean I'm doing anything wrong. He stood up slowly, gathering his papers with deliberate care. Okay, he said simply. Okay, I repeated, confused by his lack of fight. If you say nothing's wrong, then nothing's wrong, he said. I'll stop being paranoid and insecure. He walked toward the stairs, then paused at the doorway. Just so you know, I'm meeting with a lawyer tomorrow about protecting the kids' interests if this marriage continues to deteriorate. The casual way he delivered this bombshell left me speechless. By the time I recovered enough to respond, he was already gone, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the growing realization that I might have seriously underestimated my husband's capacity for strategic thinking. That night, I lay awake listening to him breathe in the bed beside me, wondering when exactly the predictable, emotional man I'd married had become someone I couldn't read at all. I was about to find out just how much I'd miscalculated. Over the next few weeks, I watched my carefully constructed world begin to crumble in ways I hadn't anticipated. Ewan's threat about meeting with a lawyer should have worried me more, but I'd convinced myself it was just another emotional manipulation, a way to scare me into admitting to something I wasn't ready to confess. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first sign that things were spiraling beyond my control came when Carla stopped returning my calls. My sister, who had been my closest confidant since childhood, was suddenly too busy to meet for lunch, too tired to talk on the phone, too something to maintain our usual relationship. When I finally cornered her at our nephew's birthday party, she pulled me aside with an expression I'd never seen before. Disappointment mixed with something that looked almost like grief. I can't do this anymore, Thalassa, she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. I can't sit here and listen to you justify what you're doing to your family. What am I doing to my family? I demanded, though my heart was racing. Carla, you're acting like I committed some terrible crime. Haven't you? She asked simply. Thalassa, I know about the affair. The words hit me like a physical blow. I don't know what you think you know, but David saw you, she continued relentlessly. Last Tuesday at that cafe downtown, with a man who definitely wasn't your husband. And the way you were touching each other. She shook her head. It wasn't a business meeting. I felt trapped, cornered by my own carelessness. Mason and I had been getting bolder lately, meeting in more public places, less concerned about who might see us. I'd told myself we were just two adults enjoying each other's company, but seeing the disgust in my sister's eyes, I realized how it must have looked to an outsider. You don't understand, I said desperately. My marriage has been over for years. Ewan and I are just going through the motions. Does Ewan know that? Carla asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like he's been trying to save your marriage while you've been busy destroying it. He's been trying to control me, I shot back, trying to keep me trapped in this suburban housewife role that I've outgrown. Carla stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mentally cataloguing all the ways I'd changed over the past few months. The lies, the defensiveness, the complete inability to take responsibility for my actions. I love you, she said finally, but I can't watch you do this anymore. And I won't lie for you if Ewan asks me directly about what David saw. The threat was clear, and it sent me into a panic that lasted for days. If Carla was willing to testify about my affair, what other evidence might be mounting against me? I started paying closer attention to Ewan's behavior, looking for signs that he was building some kind of case. What I found terrified me. My husband had become a different person, methodical, observant, quietly documenting everything in ways I was only beginning to understand. The journal I'd seen him writing in had multiplied into several notebooks, all carefully hidden, but not so well that I couldn't find them when he was at work. Reading through his meticulous records of my behavior was like seeing myself through a stranger's eyes. He'd documented every late night, every suspicious phone call, every lie I'd told about working late. He'd noted the times I'd been unreachable, the charges on our joint credit card that didn't match my explanations, the way our children had started asking why Mommy was always angry. But it was the photographs that really shook me. Somehow, Ewan had managed to document my meetings with Mason in ways that left no doubt about the nature of our relationship. Pictures of us kissing in his car, holding hands at the cafe, entering and leaving his apartment together. The images were damning, undeniable proof of my infidelity that would hold up in any court of law. I confronted him that evening after the children were asleep, waving the photographs in his face like accusations. "How long have you been spying on me?" I demanded. "How long have you been planning this ambush?" He looked at the pictures with detached interest, as if they depicted strangers rather than his wife committing adultery. "I haven't been spying," he said calmly. "I've been protecting my interests, and more importantly, protecting our children's interests." "Our children," I laughed, but it sounded hysterical even to me. "What does this have to do with Lila and Toby?" "Everything," he said, meeting my eyes for the first time in weeks. "Do you think they don't notice that their mother has checked out of this family? Do you think they don't see how you've been treating me, treating them, treating everyone who loves you?" "I'm not treating anyone badly," I protested. "I'm just trying to figure out what I need to be happy." "At everyone else's expense," he said quietly, "including theirs." The accusation hit me harder than it should have, mainly because I couldn't entirely deny it. I had been distracted lately, less present with the children, more focused on my own needs and desires than on their emotional well-being. "So what's your plan?" I asked, trying to regain some control of the conversation. "Blackmail me into staying in a marriage that makes us both miserable?" "I'm not blackmailing anyone," Ewan said, taking the photographs from my hands with careful deliberation. "I'm documenting the breakdown of our marriage so that when it ends, and it will end, Thalassa, I can ensure our children have the stability they deserve." The certainty in his voice chilled me. This wasn't the emotional, pleading husband I'd been dealing with for months. This was someone who had already made his decision and was simply following through on a plan I'd been too self-absorbed to see developing. "You can't just take my children away from me," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I'm not taking them away from you," he replied. "I'm protecting them from the chaos you've brought into their lives. There's a difference." That night, I called Mason in a panic, needing someone to tell me that Ewan was overreacting, that his threats were empty, that everything would work out in my favor. "Maybe it's time to come clean," Mason said, and I could hear the distance in his voice that had been growing for weeks. "Tell him you want to divorce and move on with your life." "It's not that simple," I said. "He has evidence, pictures, documentation. If this goes to court—" "Look, Thalassa," Mason interrupted, "this is getting complicated in ways I didn't sign up for. Maybe we should take a break until you get your situation sorted out." The line went dead, leaving me alone with the realization that the man I'd risked everything for was abandoning me at the first sign of real consequences. I was completely on my own, facing a husband who had quietly transformed from victim to strategist, with evidence that could destroy any chance I had of maintaining custody of my children or keeping any semblance of the life I'd taken for granted. And the worst part was, I was finally beginning to understand that I had no one to blame but myself. In that polished office, the truth wasn't emotional anymore. It was organized. Photos, records, statements, even a counselor's notes, all arranged like a map of my collapse. Patricia didn't need to raise her voice because the evidence did it for her, and Ewan didn't need to argue because he'd already decided the ending. I tried every doorway, calling it entrapment, begging for counseling, insisting I chose happiness. None of it mattered, because the room wasn't measuring my feelings. It was measuring my pattern, and the pattern said deception, volatility, and children learning to fear the temperature of their own home. Then came the terms: primary custody for him, supervised visits for me, and a settlement that was generous only because it was also leverage. Sign quietly, keep the details contained, fight, and watch the story become public until it destroys the last pieces of my life that still stand. It wasn't romance or revenge, it was risk management. Ewan's final sentence was the cruelest, precisely because it wasn't cruel. I loved you. Past tense. Not, I love you, but not, we can fix this. Just a closed door with a human voice behind it. And when he said he couldn't let me hurt the kids the way I hurt him, it landed as something worse than anger, moral clarity. So I signed. Not because I agreed, but because I understood I'd already lost the only bargaining chip that matters in court or marriage: trust. And when I heard him tell Patricia that all communication would go through her from now on, it wasn't drama, it was burial, a clean legal burial of the relationship. 6 months later, the punishment isn't the apartment or the job, it's the shape of the visits, supervised, scheduled, polite, distant. It's watching my kids treat me like someone they're safer around when there's a witness present. It's seeing Ewan at school events and realizing he doesn't ignore me out of spite. He ignores me because, in his mind, the version of me he loved is dead. And that's the real twist of the freedom I demanded. It doesn't feel like open space. It feels like being removed from the center of your own life. One signature, one email, one quiet click of a closing door at a time.